What happens when a country music legend walks into a morning show expecting an easy chat and walks out making television history? That's exactly what unfolded when Faith Hill appeared live on Good Morning America. The cameras were rolling, the audience sipping their coffee, and within minutes, an ordinary interview turned into one of the most talked about moments in broadcast TV. No one could have predicted it. The morning had started like any other. Faith arrived at the studio smiling, her trademark warmth lighting up the set. She waved to fans, exchanged friendly hellos with the crew, and took her seat opposite George Stephanopoulos. It was supposed to be a relaxed conversation, promote her new album, share a few behind-the-scenes stories, maybe talk about family life. The stage lights softened, the theme music faded, the red O'Nair light blinked. George began smoothly, the way only a seasoned host can. Faith Hill, welcome back to Good Morning America. It's great to have you here. Faith smiled, her voice gentle, but confident.
Thank you, George. Always happy to be here.
Everything seemed fine, easy routine, until George turned a page on his notes. Before we dive into the album, he said casually, I have to ask. There's been a lot of talk lately about your comments on how the industry treats women past a certain age. Some say you were being unfair. What's your response to that? The air changed instantly. Faith's smile held, but her expression sharpened. Well, she began slowly. I think some people may have misunderstood what I meant. I wasn't criticizing anyone. I was sharing my experience. The tension in the room thickened. Viewers at home might have leaned a little closer. George pressed on. But when you speak publicly, don't you think you carry a responsibility not to divide people? Faith tilted her head. So, I shouldn't speak about something that makes others uncomfortable. For a split second, neither of them spoke. The silence was electric. That was the moment everything started to shift from polite conversation to something far more raw. Faith wasn't just defending a quote anymore. She was defending her right to speak her truth, and the audience could feel it. The studio lights seemed brighter now, like they were watching, too. George leaned forward, his pen tapping lightly against the cards. Faith stayed poised, but there was tension in the air you could almost see. Faith, George said, you've had one of the most successful careers in country music history. Some people might wonder why someone at your level feels the need to talk about being overlooked. It was subtle, but the implication landed hard. Faith gave a small, polite laugh, though her eyes didn't match the smile. George, success doesn't erase reality. It just makes people assume you don't have struggles anymore. She sat up a little straighter. I've worked in this industry for decades. I've seen doors quietly close for women once they reach a certain age. I'm not angry about it. I'm just not pretending it doesn't happen. George nodded, pretending to agree, but his next question came sharp. Do you think maybe your comments came off as bitter? Some critics have said your new songs sound that way. The word bitter hung in the air like a spark waiting to catch. Faith's hands rested calmly in her lap, but her tone changed. Controlled, steady, unmistakably firm. Bitter, she repeated. That's interesting because when a man writes about heartbreak or frustration, it's called honest. When a woman does it, it's called bitter. The crowd reacted with a low murmur. The producer's eyes darted to the control booth. George tried to steady the ship. I think people just see passion differently. Faith looked him dead in the eye. No, George, they judge it differently. That's when the energy in the studio completely shifted. The friendly chat had turned into a confrontation about something bigger, something that went beyond music. For the viewers at home, it was compelling television. For everyone in the studio, it was chaos wrapped in composure. Faith wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. Every word hit with precision. Every sentence was a statement. And George, for the first time that morning, looked unsettled. He straightened his tie, tried to pivot. Let's talk about your new album. Some early reviews describe it as more personal, even darker. Were you trying to send a message? Faith smiled again, but this time it wasn't warm. The only message, she said slowly, is that I'm not afraid to tell the truth. That line hit harder than any lyric she'd ever sung. The room felt smaller, like the walls had inched closer. George glanced at the camera, then back at Faith, weighing his next step. The safe route was to pivot. He didn't take it. Here's what viewers want to know, he said, voice a notch firmer. When you talk about age in the industry, aren't you painting with a wide brush? Isn't that divisive? There it was. The word that changes an interview into a battle. Faith didn't flinch. Divisive? She repeated slow and measured. George, I'm describing what I lived. That's not a slogan. That's my career. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Each word landed with quiet force. He tried to frame it as responsibility. You have influence. People listen to you. Doesn't that mean you have to be careful about the message? Careful, she said, tilting her head. Or quiet. A soft ripple moved through the audience. In the control room, hands hovered over buttons. No one wanted to cut away. No one could. George leaned in. You've won awards. You've sold millions. Some say you're not the best example of someone held back. That line drew a line. Faith gave a small, breathy laugh that wasn't really a laugh. So success means I'm not allowed to talk about the hurdles. That doesn't make sense, George. Winning a race doesn't mean the track was level. He pressed on, looking for footing. Critics say the album sounds disillusioned, that it lingers on disappointment. When a man writes about struggle, Faith replied, it's depth. When a woman does, it's disillusionment. Why is that silence, the kind that carries weight? George shifted. I think you're reading a lot into word choice. I'm reading patterns, she said. Patterns that follow women long after the spotlight moves. Her posture never broke. Her tone never cracked. The power came from control, not volume. She wasn't just answering. She was reframing the premise of every question. George tried again. This time with numbers. Labels invest where the market is. It's not personal. Faith met that idea head-on. Markets don't appear out of thin air. People shaped them. People choose who gets airplay, who gets budget, who gets framed as classic, and who gets called past their prime. Those choices add up. Another murmur. Another glance to the booth. Still no commercial. George stacked his cards. Look, I'm asking what our viewers are asking. If the questions feel tough, it's because the topic is tough. And I'm answering, she said. But there's a difference between tough and dismissive. Between curiosity and correction. That line shifted everything. The tone, the balance, the ground under the conversation. For the first time, George exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. So, what would a fair question sound like? Faith didn't miss a beat. Try starting with listening. The audience didn't clap. They didn't need to. The moment said enough. The interview had begun as promo. It had become a reckoning. Calm, clear, and unshakable. And the next question would decide whether the conversation cooled or boiled over. The interview was no longer about music. It was about something bigger. Respect, perception, and the power dynamics playing out live on air. George's tone sharpened just slightly. The kind of edge that audiences feel before they hear. So let's be honest, Faith, he said. Don't you think calling the industry unfair makes it sound like you're attacking it? The question landed like a spark in dry grass. Faith leaned back, calm but fierce. I'm not attacking the industry, George. I'm describing it. There's a difference. George raised an eyebrow. But when millions look up to you, don't you think your words carry weight? Maybe some people just see it as complaining. That word complaining changed everything. Faith blinked, then smiled, but her eyes stayed fixed. Complaining? I've spent years working twice as hard to prove I still belong in the same conversations I started. That's not complaining. That's reality. The audience shifted in their seats. The silence wasn't awkward. It was alive. Faith continued, her voice level and deliberate. When women talk about inequality, it's labeled emotional. When men do it, it's labeled brave. Why do you think that is? George opened his mouth, but no sound came. The control room hesitated, unsure if this was genius television or an on-air disaster. Faith wasn't angry. She was composed, powerful, unshakable. You invited me here to talk about my work, she said. But the moment I spoke honestly, the tone changed. That's not journalism. That's resistance to truth. George straightened, visibly uncomfortable. I'm simply asking tough questions. Tough questions come from curiosity, Faith replied. These come from doubt. That line hit hard. Every producer in the booth froze. No one cut to commercial. No one dared. For the first time, George looked less like a host and more like someone realizing the conversation had slipped out of his control. Faith, he said quietly. You're being defensive. Faith's smile returned, cool and controlled.
No, George.
I'm being clear. A single camera zoomed in on her face. Steady, unwavering, lit with the calm of someone who'd stopped needing approval. And in that moment, everyone watching knew this wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a mirror held up to an entire industry. The air in the studio felt heavy now. Every light seemed to hum louder, every second longer than it should be. Faith sat perfectly still, her posture calm, her composure absolute. George shuffled his cue cards, trying to find a way back. Any way back, he forced a smile. Let's try to move forward, he said, the words tight around the edges. You mentioned recently that you have to work harder now to get the same recognition you once did. Could you explain what you meant by that? Faith's reply came slow and measured. Sure, George. When I was younger, I didn't have to fight to be heard. My songs were on every radio station. My face was on every magazine cover. But over time, I watched those same doors close. Not because my talent changed, but because I aged. She paused, letting that truth hang in the air. The funny thing is, she added softly, I'm a better artist now than I've ever been. George nodded too quickly. But the music industry is a business. It has to respond to the market. That's not discrimination. It's economics. Faith tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. So, it's just good business to stop valuing women after a certain age. That's what you're saying? George hesitated. I'm saying the audience changes. Faith leaned forward just a little. And who decides what audiences want, George? Who tells them what's worth listening to? The same people who stop promoting artists once they turn 40. That's not an accident. That's conditioning. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric. The kind that says, everyone knows she's right, but no one's ready to admit it. George adjusted his mic. You make it sound like the system is rigged. Faith's response was soft, but certain. It doesn't have to be rigged to be unfair. That one line silenced the entire set. Even the crew stopped moving. The hum of the lights, the faint buzz from the monitors. It all blended into the stillness of that moment. Faith sat back, her presence filling the space, her voice steady. This isn't about bitterness, George. It's about being honest enough to say the system rewards youth over experience and pretending it doesn't only keeps the problem alive. George looked down at his notes, but didn't turn the page. For the first time, he had nothing to add. Faith folded her hands in her lap. You can call it uncomfortable, she said, but I call it overdue. And the studio knew there was no going back to small talk now. The tension had reached a quiet peak. That dangerous calm that comes when truth has been spoken out loud and there's no taking it back. George leaned in, voice lower now, almost pleading. Faith, you've had such a long, respected career. Don't you think some people just misread your intentions? Maybe they don't understand what you're trying to say. Faith met his gaze without blinking. Then maybe they should start listening instead of assuming. Her tone wasn't sharp. It was precise, controlled. You could tell she'd had this conversation before, just never with millions watching. George sighed, a little exasperated. You have to admit, though, some of your comments about the industry being unfair might sound like you're blaming everyone. Faith gave a small smile, almost kind. I'm not blaming everyone. I'm asking everyone to notice. That's a big difference. She leaned forward slightly. If saying what's true makes people uncomfortable, that's not my problem. It's their wake-up call. That line hung heavy in the air. George tried to steady the tone. I think what you're describing isn't unique to music. Every industry changes. Faith nodded. You're right. It happens everywhere. But when women speak up about it, the story becomes about their tone instead of their message. We're told to calm down, smile more, or be grateful. But you can't fix a problem you refuse to name. The studio audience stayed silent, afraid even to breathe too loudly. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was confrontation wrapped in truth. George shuffled his cards again, his polished calm slipping. Faith, are you suggesting that success and gratitude can't coexist? I'm saying honesty and comfort rarely do, she replied. I can be grateful for my career and still see the cracks in the wall. For a moment, even George couldn't hide his reaction. A flicker of realization, the kind that happens when someone's words land deeper than expected. Faith continued, softer now, but unwavering. Every woman who speaks up about bias gets told she's making it up, exaggerating, or being dramatic. But ask her privately, and she'll tell you she's tired of pretending it's fine. I just stopped pretending publicly. The weight of her words settled over the set like a blanket. George opened his mouth to respond, but she gently cut him off. You don't have to agree, George. You just have to hear me. That single sentence carried more power than every question before it. George leaned back, silent. Cameras kept rolling. Crew members exchanged wide-eyed looks. Faith Hill wasn't there to promote anymore. She was rewriting the narrative live. The next few seconds stretched endlessly. Cameras stayed trained on Faith, and every viewer at home could sense it. Something real was happening. George exhaled, forcing a smile. Faith, I think we're just trying to understand your perspective. You've always been known for grace and optimism. Some people were surprised to see this side of you. Faith turned her head slightly. This side of me has always been here, she said softly. It's just that people like it better when it smiles through everything. Her voice stayed even, but the truth underneath it was sharp enough to cut. George nodded as if conceding a point, but then tried again. You have to admit, the way you speak about the industry, it can sound like resentment. Faith gave a quiet laugh. Resentment?
No. Clarity, maybe.
The difference is intent. Resentment wants revenge. Clarity wants change. That line hit like a note, perfectly struck, clean, undeniable. George hesitated. His eyes darted toward the control room, searching for a cue, but none came. The producers weren't stopping this. They knew what they had. A moment that couldn't be scripted. Faith kept going. You know what's funny? When men tell their truth, they're called brave. When women do, it's labeled attitude.
That's not an opinion, George.
That's a pattern. The audience stirred again. Someone near the back nodded subtly. A quiet agreement from someone who understood. George tried to hold on to his ground. I just think tone matters. People respond better when things are said calmly. Faith smiled almost kindly. Tone matters more to the people who don't want to hear the message. That response earned a soft gasp from somewhere in the crowd. George straightened, defensive now. I'm just saying everyone faces challenges. Men too. I never said they didn't, Faith replied. But not every challenge is equal. And pretending they are just keeps things comfortable for the ones who benefit. Her delivery was calm, but her words carried the precision of someone done apologizing for truth. George tried once more, the weight of live TV pressing down on him. Faith, are you saying this industry is intentionally biased? Faith met his gaze head-on. I'm saying bias doesn't need to be intentional to exist. It's baked into habits, decisions, and who gets a chance to be heard. That's why conversations like this matter, even when they get uncomfortable. For the first time all morning, George didn't respond right away. The silence that followed was thick, not awkward, but transformative. The camera zoomed in slightly. Faith looked composed, calm, unbreakable. No shouting, no tears, just truth laid bare in front of millions. And in that moment, everyone watching in the studio and at home knew they were witnessing something rare. Not an outburst, but a boundary. Faith Hill wasn't losing control. She was reclaiming it. The studio had gone still. Even the air felt cautious, as if afraid to interrupt what was unfolding. George looked at his notes, but didn't read them. He knew this wasn't just another segment anymore. It was a live reckoning. He took a slow breath. Faith, I respect your passion, he said carefully. But I think this conversation has taken a difficult turn. Faith smiled faintly. It's only difficult because it's honest. George tried to steady his voice. I think we've gone off topic. This was meant to be about your album. Faith nodded once. It still is, George. My music is about truth. And this, she gestured around them, is exactly what that truth looks like when you say it out loud. You could feel it. The balance of power had shifted. The interviewer was no longer in control of the interview. George pressed on, his tone tightening. People might see this and think you're being defensive. Faith's smile didn't fade. A woman standing up for herself always looks defensive to someone who's used to her being quiet. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd. George blinked, unsure how to respond. Faith, he said finally, you're taking this the wrong way. Faith leaned forward, calm but firm. There's no wrong way to tell your truth. There's just people who aren't ready to hear it. That landed like thunder. Soft, inevitable, final. George hesitated. I think we should take a quick break. Faith slowly reached for her mic. No, George. You can take a break if you need to. I'm done. Her movements were steady. She unclipped her mic, placed it gently on the table, and stood up. The room froze. Faith, George began, but she cut in quietly. This interview stopped being about music the moment my experiences became uncomfortable for you. The audience held its
Breath.
Faith looked around the studio, then straight into the nearest camera, something guests rarely dared to do. She spoke clearly. To every woman watching, don't let anyone tell you your truth is too much. Don't shrink to make someone else comfortable. You owe them nothing. Then she turned back to George. You asked for honesty, George. I gave it to you. What you do with it is up to you. And with that, Faith Hill walked off the set, shoulders back, expression steady, grace intact. The cameras followed her until she reached the edge of the frame, then held for one long, silent second before cutting to commercial. In that moment, the network may have lost control of an interview, but Faith Hill gained something far greater. She didn't storm out. She walked out, and she left behind a message louder than any song could ever sing. When the broadcast cut to commercial, the studio fell into stunned silence. Crew members stared at one another, unsure if what they just witnessed was career chaos or cultural clarity. George sat frozen in his chair, eyes fixed on the empty seat across from him where Faith Hill had just been. It took several seconds before anyone moved. A producer finally broke the silence with a quiet, "We're clear." But the truth was, nothing about that moment was clear anymore. Within minutes, clips of the walkout started flooding social media. The internet didn't wait for an official statement. Viewers had recorded everything from their TVs, posting captions like, Faith Hill just spoke for every woman who's ever been dismissed. Others argued she'd overreacted. Debates spread faster than any PR team could control. But no one could deny one thing. Everyone was talking about Faith Hill again. Some called it defiance. Others called it dignity. Most just called it unforgettable. By the end of the day, hashtags like Ikiak Faith Hill interview and Ikayaker Standing Your Truth were trending worldwide. The network issued a polite, neutral statement about a passionate live discussion, but it couldn't contain the story. Major outlets ran headlines like Faith Hill walks out after confrontational interview and Good Morning America segment sparks debate on sexism in country music. Behind the scenes, sources close to Faith said she had no regrets. She didn't plan to make a statement. One insider shared she just refused to let herself be talked down to on or off camera. Fans flooded her pages with messages of support. You said what needed to be said. Thank you for standing up with grace. That wasn't an interview. That was history. Meanwhile, analysts debated whether George Stephanopoulos had gone too far. Some defended his line of questioning as journalism. Others said he crossed into something colder, the habit of dismissing women's voices as emotion instead of experience. For Faith, it didn't matter. The moment had spoken louder than any defense ever could. She'd walked away, but not from weakness, from disrespect. That distinction resonated with millions, especially women who'd faced the same quiet dismissal in their own workplaces and relationships. And while the headlines would fade, the moment itself wouldn't. It had already become something else, a lesson in boundaries, composure, and the strength of silence. When the next morning's show began, George opened with a carefully written acknowledgement about valuing open dialogue. But viewers noticed the hesitation in his tone. Something had changed, not just for him, but for the way people viewed these interviews entirely. Because after Faith Hill, just another talk show moment didn't mean the same thing anymore. The days that followed proved one thing. Faith Hill hadn't just walked out of an interview. She'd walked straight into history. Clips of her calm defiance filled feeds across every platform. Late-night hosts dissected it. Podcasts debated it. Industry veterans privately admitted what many already knew. Faith had said the quiet part out loud. She hadn't yelled, insulted, or stormed off. She simply decided that respect was non-negotiable. And that's what made it powerful. For years, Faith Hill had been the image of grace and professionalism. Polite, composed, easy to love. But this moment showed something deeper. Boundaries don't cancel grace. They define it. Her silence as she removed the mic, her steady tone, her refusal to trade truth for comfort, it all became a masterclass in strength. Media experts called it the most impactful moment of live television in recent memory. Young artists called it permission. Within weeks, interviews across networks started to look different. Hosts asked better questions. Producers rethought how they handled conversations with female guests. Even rival musicians, many who'd stayed quiet for years, began to speak up about similar experiences. What Faith sparked wasn't outrage. It was reflection. In one later statement, she said simply, "I didn't plan that moment. I just realized I didn't have to explain myself anymore." That line became its own anthem, quoted in articles and stitched into TikToks. People weren't celebrating a confrontation. They were celebrating self-respect. Even George Stephanopoulos weeks later addressed it again. On air, he admitted the tone could have been different. "That conversation reminded me," he said, "that listening is part of the job." It was short, careful, but it mattered. Growth always starts small. Faith never turned the walkout into a PR moment. She let the story breathe, and that silence spoke volumes. Her next performance, months later, drew record viewership. When she walked onto that stage, the applause wasn't just for her music. It was for her message. A single moment of standing up, not shouting, not attacking, had shifted the balance between celebrity and interviewer, between woman and narrative. In a world that often rewards silence, Faith Hill proved that grace can have a backbone. So when fans look back on that morning, they won't remember it as a scandal. They'll remember it as the day a woman refused to be small on live television and reminded everyone watching that truth doesn't need permission. And maybe that's why the moment still echoes, because deep down, everyone knows sometimes walking away isn't quitting. It's reclaiming the conversation. As the credits rolled that day, and the cameras faded to black, something bigger than a TV interview had taken place. Faith Hill didn't just walk off a set. She walked into a new kind of conversation, one that still hasn't ended. Her choice to stand firm, to speak without rage, but with conviction reshaped how millions saw strength. She showed that control isn't about staying silent. It's about knowing when silence isn't enough. That moment became a mirror reflecting back an uncomfortable truth about how